Rumors, legends, secrets. The veil of mystery surrounding the Holy Grail has persisted for 20 centuries. Virtually all that can be said with certainty about this sacred treasure is that the search for it must start in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus Christ. During the 1st century AD, the world belonged to Rome. Judea was just another backwater province, and a troublesome one at that. After decades of subjugation, some in Judea had begun to actively resist Roman rule. Jesus of Nazareth was swept up in the winds of change. The Gospels report that Jesus disavowed a political agenda. Nevertheless, he was perceived as a threat and charged with treason. Shortly before his arrest, Jesus celebrated the Jewish festival of Passover with his disciples. It was at this fateful meal, the Last Supper, that the chalice, eventually known as the Holy Grail, first appears. That night, as recounted in the Gospels, Jesus performed the very first Mass, transforming the wine in his chalice into blood.
And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood." Matthew 26, verses 27 and 8.
Jesus was seized within hours of the Last Supper. The following day, he was crucified. The Gospels recount that Christ's body was taken down for burial by a loyal disciple, a wealthy merchant known as Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph interred Jesus in a tomb he had prepared for his own eventual use. Then he vanishes from the Gospels. Neither Joseph of Arimathea nor the cup of the Last Supper is ever mentioned again. It is not until the rise of medieval tales known as the Grail romances that Joseph and the Grail become inextricably linked. At least one medieval source claims that the Grail was actually made for Jesus by Joseph of Arimathea. Others say that just after the crucifixion, Joseph gathered some of Christ's blood in the Holy Grail. But then, what happened to the chalice? Christ's disciples reportedly feared a clampdown by Rome as word of the resurrection began to circulate. Some medieval authors said that Joseph spirited the Grail to the most distant outpost of the Roman Empire.
According to the legends, Joseph set out on a journey which led him to Europe and then eventually to Britain and then eventually to Glastonbury, and there apparently built a shrine to house the Grail.
The sprawling Roman Empire encompassed much of the known world. Glastonbury was far to the north in the province of Britannia, a daunting 3,000 miles from the Holy Land. Yet even during the time of Jesus, trading routes linked these two far-flung regions. It was in Glastonbury that Joseph of Arimathea is said to have built a shrine to house the Grail at the dawn of Christianity. According to the legends, the church was a simple structure of wood beams and mud-covered branches, roofed over with thatch. Recent excavations suggest that these tales may not be too far wrong.
The remains of an ancient church dating from possibly as early as 100 AD have been found in Glastonbury. Of course, this still makes it a little too late for Joseph, but it does mean that there was a Christian presence in Britain at around about that early.
Finding the Grail itself has been rather more difficult. Age-old stories claim it was buried less than a mile from the church, somewhere near this natural spring, known today as Chalice Well. The spring water here deposits a reddish sediment. Science tells us that the color signifies nothing but a high iron content. Legend, however, says the telltale stain reveals much more, that the Holy Grail, once filled with the sacred blood of Christ, is concealed close by. Still other accounts claim the Grail remained in the church built by Joseph of Arimathea under the care of his descendants. When this rustic shrine evolved into Glastonbury Abbey, guardianship of the Grail supposedly passed to the resident monks. However, possession of the Holy Grail was a mixed blessing, for this was one relic that put the Orthodox Church on edge. The Grail embodied an unforgivable challenge to fundamental church doctrine that St. Peter was the heir to Christ's ministry.
If there is any truth in the story that Joseph was given the cup of the Last Supper by Christ himself, this gave him a certain mandate to be the next in line, the next in succession of those teachers who were carrying on Christ's work. There are actual references in the later stories to Jesus having taught him the mysteries of his own ministry in a way that other disciples might not have been given. And this may be one of the reasons why there is a real silence on the part of the church with regard to the Grail.
If the Glastonbury monks did indeed have the Grail, they must have been tormented by their predicament. They would have held in their hands perhaps the most sacred relic in all of Christendom, the Holy Grail that had contained the blood of the Savior. Yet they dared not breathe a word of it, for fear of being branded as heretics. This dilemma may explain the change in depictions of the Grail during the 1300s. Instead of holding a chalice, Joseph was depicted with two pitchers, or cruets, of Christ's sacred blood. These vessels wouldn't invite the wrath of church officials. Unlike the Grail, the cruets did not raise the inflammatory question of who Jesus had intended as his successor. As for Joseph of Arimathea, long after his death, his name became a potent weapon in the thorny intrigues of medieval politics.
There were some jurisdictional disputes between the kings of England and the church authorities, and it was at this time that the Pope was claiming really absolute authority, spiritual authority, and in some cases even temporal authority over the kings of the world.
England's kings wanted a national church, independent of the Pope, but subservient to themselves. They cited Joseph's arrival at Glastonbury before even the church at Rome was established to support their claims of primacy over the popes. The dispute dragged Glastonbury's monks into the middle, squeezed between their pope and their king. Glastonbury Abbey managed to stay out of the political crossfire, at least for a time. By the 1500s, it had become one of England's wealthiest and most powerful monasteries. However, the end was drawing near. The simmering feud between the popes and England's kings would eventually erupt into a bloody separation. In 1533, Henry VIII severed all ties with Rome and formed the Church of England. Soon after, he slaughtered Catholic clergymen, burned their churches, and looted their treasuries. Glastonbury Abbey fell from grace with the rest. A handful of monks reportedly salvaged one cherished relic from the flames, an ancient olive wood bowl. Even now, some claim it is the Holy Grail itself. The monks fled west towards Wales, carrying the precious wooden bowl with them. They eventually found refuge at a stately manor known as the Nantios House, ancestral home of the Powell family. Guardianship of the Nantios Cup, as it became known, remained with the Powells for some 400 years. During that time, the cup earned a reputation for effecting miraculous cures. Those who drank from it were said to be healed of ills ranging from fevers to epilepsy.
Unfortunately, a number of people who came to drink from it would bite little bits of wood off the rim of the cup as they drank, and keep these in their mouths until they got away. So in other words, they were taking a little piece of the sacred cup gradually it became so whittled away that in the end the family decided that it would no longer be kept on open show and would not be available any longer for people to drink from.
Today, a Powell family descendant living in this secluded cottage retains custody of the Nantios cup. The centuries of handling and the teeth of the faithful have taken their toll. Only this fragment remains. Even incomplete, the Nantios cup promises the miraculous. Water is poured over the chalice and placed on special prayer cloths, which are then sent to those in need. Stunning cures for rheumatism, leprosy, even blindness are reported to this day. Perhaps the Nantios cup is indeed the chalice of the Last Supper, the Grail of story and legend. Certainly it seems appropriate that Jesus' cup be made from a humble material like wood. Yet other legends say that the Grail was never taken to Glastonbury. According to these stories, Christ's chalice was hidden in Jerusalem after the crucifixion. There it remained for 1,000 years, to be rediscovered during the First Crusade. If any one place on earth embodies the spiritual aspirations of humanity, it is the ancient city of Jerusalem. Sacred ground for Muslims, Christians, and Jews, Jerusalem is also a fitting stage for an epic legend of the Holy Grail. According to some accounts, in the aftermath of Christ's crucifixion, the Grail was hidden away beneath the Temple of Solomon. It would remain there, undisturbed, for 1,000 years, until the era of the Crusades. At the close of the 11th century, church authorities preached a military campaign to capture the Holy Land, controlled at the time by Muslim rulers. All across Europe, soldiers joined the ranks of the First Crusade. In July of 1099, after a bloody 5-week siege, Christian forces led by Duke Godefroy de Bouillon entered Jerusalem in triumph. De Bouillon became the first ruler of what was called the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. Before long, religious pilgrims set out from Europe, intent on seeing the sacred land of Jesus for themselves. To protect these travelers, a French nobleman by the name of Hugh de Payen established an order of soldier monks, known today as the Knights Templar. Hugh de Payen and 8 other knights arrived in the Holy Land around 1118. However, their plans seem to have changed.
In fact, established themselves in Jerusalem at a place roughly where the ancient temple, the ancient sacred temple of the Jewish faith had stood. And then rumors began to circulate that they had in fact begun to excavate under this temple and that they may have found some kind of sacred treasure. The tradition is that they found the Grail and that they themselves then became the guardian of it.
Whether or not the Knights Templar recovered a sacred treasure, or if the Grail itself was hidden beneath the temple, may never be known. However, it is a matter of historical record that in a relatively brief time, the Templars emerged as one of the wealthiest, most powerful forces in the entire medieval world. Hugh de Payen's band of 8 knights grew to a bristling international order of more than 20,000. The Templars established a trading network around the Mediterranean and owned property across the known world.
The Templars were tremendously powerful because largely they were extremely rich. They were the bankers for most of Europe. They loaned immense amounts of money to the various crowned heads of Europe to enable them to undertake crusades and other work. And then suddenly they fall from grace.
The Knights Templar, once protected by the Church, abruptly faced its condemnation. In the early 1300s, Rome accused the order of heresy, devil worship, and immoral practices. The King of France stepped forward with great enthusiasm to punish the Templars.
Part of the reason for this may be simply the fact that they became too powerful. Certainly Philip the Fair, King of France, who was their main persecutor, owed them a lot of money. But it's been suggested, certainly, that the reason why the Templars were suddenly hounded out of existence was because the Church became aware of the fact that they were in some way at the center of an alternative system of belief, and decided to basically have it stamped out as quickly as possible.
On a Friday the 13th in 1307, agents of King Philip rounded up virtually every Templar in France. Most were tortured, and many were burned at the stake. Their treasure, however, was never found. It has long been rumored that a few Templars managed to escape with the Order's riches, perhaps including the Grail. Many believe they found refuge at Roslin Castle in Scotland, home of the Sinclair family. The Templars' close ties to the Sinclairs dated back 200 years, to the very beginnings of the order. Catherine St. Clair, of the French line of Sinclair nobles, was married to Hugh de Payen, founder of the Knights Templar.
So the Templars knew that they would have a safe haven in Scotland. And of course they made straight for Roslin and the Sinclair family, and they took the treasure with them.
Roslin Chapel, built by William Sinclair in the 1400s, has long been associated with both the Templar treasure and the Holy Grail.
The Sinclair family were themselves high-up members of the Templar order, and they seem to have built the chapel using an immense amount of symbolism. If you look at the carvings that riot all over the inside of this building, there are elements that draw upon Christian and pre-Christian myth, on Templar teaching, and on the tradition of the Grail.
Boldly displayed in the chapel's east end is this pagan image, a symbol of fertility known as the Green Man. More than 100 of these spirits peer out from the chapel's arches and vaults. A series of allegorical carvings shows kings and commoners engaged in their daily activities, escorted at every turn by the figure of death. It is a sober reminder of life's many possibilities and its one certainty. Here, two weary knights persevere on a quest for the Holy Grail, while just down the aisle, Joseph of Arimathea holds it perpetually out of their reach. High up on the ceiling, a carving of Jesus appears, nestled among the stars.
William Sinclair built Roslin Chapel at a time when he knew that books could be burned or banned, so he wanted to leave a message for posterity, and he had that chiseled out in stone.
It has been said that Roslin Chapel is more than a symbolic spiritual message. It is the final resting place of the Grail itself. Some claim the cup was hidden within this column, known as the Apprentice Pillar. Others have suggested that both the Grail and the Templar fortune are hidden in vaults that lie beneath the chapel. However, the Sinclair family says that probes with sonar equipment revealed no trace of either treasure. Still, there are some lingering questions underfoot at Roslin.
We know that there are 3 tunnels which emanate from the chapel. We are hopeful that one day that we will be able to trace these tunnels to their termination.
Though the tunnels may promise some answers, those who know where to look inside the chapel may find hints that the mystery of the Grail did not stop here at Roslin. These carvings near the south entryway show a species of aloe cactus known only in the New World. Arching over a nearby window is another plant native to the Americas, Indian corn. Given that Roslin Chapel was built before Columbus came to the New World, how did the Sinclairs know about these plants that live across the Atlantic? Some say the carvings are clues to a stunning Grail mystery. the birth of a secret branch of Christianity and its perilous journey to the New World. Some described it as a cup. Others said it was flatter, more like a bowl. It was made of fine gold, read one account. It was fashioned of wood, claimed others. Vessels of all sorts, like this agate bowl owned by the Habsburg family of Austria, were thought to be the Holy Grail, the container used to collect the blood of Jesus. However, according to one extraordinary theory, the Holy Grail is not an object of any kind. Rather, the Grail is a bloodline, a holy lineage descended from Jesus himself. The majority of Christians understand Jesus to be both man and God. He is at once human and divine. The bloodline theory claims even more, that Jesus was married and fathered children. Of the many different interpretations of the Holy Grail, this is the most controversial of them all. Indeed, during medieval times, anyone espousing such beliefs risked the charge of heresy and the unforgiving judgment of the Inquisition.
The legend goes, and the underground history goes, that Jesus was married. He was married to Mary Magdalene. They had children. These children married into the bloodlines of various noble and royal European families. And it was this lineage that actually held and preserved the holy blood. One could say it was a container. It was a living container. And so in an allegorical or a poetic way, people call this the Grail.
This theory is based in part on a remarkable ancient manuscript known as the Gospel of Philip. It was part of a treasury of early Christian texts uncovered near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi in 1945. Most were written by sects known as the Gnostic Christians, and all were condemned as heretical by the Orthodox Church.
The Gnostic literature sheds a great deal of light on the Grail legend. Philip comes right out and says, this Mary Magdalene was beloved of Jesus, and he kissed her on the mouth all the time. In other words, he describes them as husband and wife, which is what the Grail tradition is all about.
Even those who disagree with this conclusion marvel at the Mary Magdalene who emerges from the Nag Hammadi texts.
They describe Mary in a very different role from the one that we see her in the Gospels. She is the enlightened one. She is the woman who knows all. She asks Jesus in some of these treatises questions about the nature of existence. They're very arcane, completely incomprehensible, many of them. But she has this extraordinary role. The disciples, particularly Peter, get very irascible about it because Christ clearly favors her, and extraordinary descriptions that don't occur anywhere else, and really manifests the early church's interest in her and her importance to them.
Later, the Orthodox Church depicted Mary Magdalene as a woman of questionable morals. Some see this as an attempt by Rome to poison any claim to power by the Grail bloodline.
The church was threatened by the idea, and the reality perhaps, that the descendants of Jesus were alive and well. If there were really descendants of Jesus, perhaps they should be in charge of Christianity, and they should be the authorities in the church.
Like other Grail legends, the bloodline theory claims that Joseph of Arimathea journeyed to Glastonbury. However, instead of a cup, he brought with him a living Grail treasure, descendants of Mary Magdalene and Jesus. During the centuries that Christians were persecuted throughout the Roman Empire, bloodline families are said to have kept a low profile. That changed dramatically in 337 AD when Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity.
At that time, then, descendants of Jesus would have had prestige. And I would imagine that a lot of families vied among themselves to marry into this lineage or have the lineage marry into it. Particularly perhaps in Wales, there are some names which suggest that certain people married into what was called then the treasure of Arimathea.
In this scenario, the Holy Bloodline later crossed over to France and married into the family of Frankish kings known as Merovingians. When this dynasty was dethroned around 750 AD, reportedly with help from the church, the bloodline retreated to southern France. This region was also home to Christian sects known as the Cathars. Regarded as heretics by Rome, the Cathars had female teachers and rejected the church hierarchy.
Benedicite, Parcite, Nobis.
It is thought by some that the Cathars and bloodline descendants became allies. The Holy Lineage is said to have re-emerged onto the world stage in 1099 in the person of Godefroy de Bouillon. Not only was de Bouillon the first ruler of Jerusalem, but according to the bloodline theory, he was a direct descendant of Christ himself.
Historians have been very puzzled about why everyone was so anxious to make Godefroy de Bouillon king of Jerusalem, because there were others in the crusade who were more noble, more powerful. The answer is that Godefroy de Bouillon apparently had genealogies proving that he was a descendant of Jesus.
This may explain why Godefroy de Bouillon was often depicted with a crown of thorns, just like his purported ancestor, Jesus Christ. This theory also suggests a new view of the Knights Templar. Their claim to being a police force protecting pilgrims was just a cover. The rumors connecting them to the Grail were closer to the truth. But it was a human treasure, not one of gold, that interested the Templars.
They were created to protect the Holy Grail, which is to say the bloodline of the de Bouillons. They were the sword arm, the elite, you might say, bodyguards of the de Bouillon dynasty.
However, even with the mighty Templars standing guard, Jerusalem fell to the Muslims in 1187. The bloodline's moment in the sun was over. The de Bouillon family and their Templar protectors retreated to the south of France. It was at precisely this time that troubadours and poets began spreading the legend of the Holy Grail.
Wolfram von Eschenbach, the author of Parsifal, does not ever come out and say that he's writing something about the bloodline of Jesus. After all, this was a heresy, and it was a secret. What he does say is that knights and maidens come from the Grail to lead people to their rights, to make human progress, and this sort of thing. He says this over and over. He doesn't call the knights knights, he calls them Templars.
Perhaps these authors were merely repeating rumors, or perhaps they were revealing a secret faith to those who could read between the lines. In 1208, Pope Innocent III launched a new crusade, but this time the target was other Christians, and allegedly the Grail bloodline itself.
People were released from prisons to fight in this crusade. You were given absolution from excommunication if you fought in this crusade and murdered other Christians. Certainly, vast quantities of French knights took place because the Cathars were also very wealthy people, and this property also could be divided up upon those who succeeded in eliminating the threat of the Cathar.
The crusade lasted some 40 years, during which thousands of Cathars were rounded up and tortured throughout France. Soldiers pursued them to remote mountain fortresses like this one at Pyripetus. The castle fell in 1240, among the last Cathar strongholds to be captured. Some 50 years later, time also ran out for the Templars, guardians of the Holy Grail. Some accounts claim that a handful of knights and descendants of the Holy Bloodline escaped by sea. What became of the lineage of Jesus and its Templar protectors? One controversial theory suggests that nearly a century before Columbus, these religious refugees ventured across the Atlantic and settled in the New World. Perched atop the rolling hills near Edinburgh, Scotland, Roslin Chapel has long been a source of rumors and speculation. The chapel was built by the Sinclair family, prominent members of the Knights Templar. Some say the chapel's enigmatic carvings allude to heretical secrets, like the fate of the Holy Bloodline and their Templar protectors after they fled France in the 1300s. King Philip's savage extermination of the French Templars is well documented, as is his failure to recover any of their fabled wealth. It is said that a few Templars managed to slip out of France on board the order's merchant ships.
It is almost certain they carried a vast amount of Templar wealth, and it may be that they carried some of the Holy Grail, that is to say, descendants of Jesus as well.
The persistent legends linking the Holy Grail with Roslin Chapel may actually refer to these religious fugitives rather than a chalice. If so, the carvings of North American plants inside the chapel might provide a clue to their ultimate destination.
The Knights Templar had found a temporary refuge in Scotland. They were looking for a new world where their ideals could take root and flourish. The new world was known about, the new world beckoned.
Some believe that Prince Henry Sinclair, whose descendants built this chapel, learned about the North American plants in 1398, when he transported Templars and bloodline descendants to the New World, nearly a century before Columbus. Prince Henry, of Scandinavian ancestry himself, is believed to have followed ancient Viking routes across the North Atlantic. A medieval account known as Zeno's Narrative tells of European ships landing on the coast of what is now Nova Scotia, a province in eastern Canada. Zeno's Narrative also reported the curious spectacle of tar bubbling up from a spring and trickling to the coast. We now know that the only place on the Atlantic seaboard fitting this description lies near the modern-day city of Stellarton in Nova Scotia. According to the bloodline theory, about 100 religious refugees stayed on in the New World. They gradually worked their way up the coast and then inland along navigable waterways in what is now the province of Quebec. It was a quest for evidence of these Grail fugitives that led writer Michael Bradley to this remote corner of Canada. Leading the way, Dr. Gerard Leduc, a retired university professor who has been studying the archaeology here for more than a decade. Much of Leduc's attention has been directed to this secluded place, where mysterious stone ruins stand sentry on the banks of a stream. The structure's location next to a waterfall suggests that it might have been a mill. The walls measure some 20 feet in length. Cutting and placing these large blocks was no easy task.
We're dealing here with cut stone measuring up to 11 feet long, and by the volume we can determine the weight, approximate weight, about 3.5 metric tons a piece. So we have some people who could handle very, very heavy stone in a very rugged environment.
But it is the apparent date of the mill's construction and its possible link to Grail refugees that gives this rustic stonework such electrifying significance. The site was studied by government archaeologists in 1992 at the request of Dr. Leduc. Among the artifacts they unearthed were these masonry tools, found in a deposit of charcoal.
The charcoal was observed by the archaeologists, and they mentioned in their report that this charcoal came from some fire that took place during the construction. Now, this was a very interesting discovery because when you have charcoal, then it enables you to have a radiocarbon date.
Dr. Leduc rushed some of the charcoal to a Florida lab for a carbon-14 test. The results were as stunning as they were unexpected. The mill may date from the medieval period, centuries earlier than any previously known settlement in the area. This finding has fueled speculation that the mill was built by Templars and bloodline descendants, brought to the New World by Prince Henry Sinclair in 1398.
This is a place they could have reached after a century or so of expansion, and there may have been enough of them to justify the construction of a mill. And I think that's what we may be looking at.
And then there's the matter of the gargoyle. Roughly a half-mile downstream from the mill, local residents discovered this extraordinary creature. It is carved of limestone, not native to the area, and appears as though it might have dropped right off a medieval church.
The mill being dated to a medieval period by carbon dating, and the gargoyle being dated to the medieval period by its style, means that probably medieval people made it, medieval European visitors, and the only certain ones that we know of is Henry Sinclair's settlement of 1398.
If Grail refugees did indeed voyage to North America, do their descendants walk among us today? Some say the bloodline will surface again in the new millennium, as it did roughly 1,000 years ago. However, others say the Orthodox Church was never troubled by fears of a holy bloodline, or even by the Grail itself.
The Grail conspiracy theories, the modern ones, are very interesting. They're a lot of fun. But really, this is a later fiction. There was no such object in the Middle Ages that the Church recognized. This came from works of fiction. And it was not taken seriously. It was recognized as fictional.
Where does the truth lie? Perhaps in a different view of the Grail, a treasure that no one can own. In the end, the Grail is a treasure trove of mystery, a chalice brimming with possibilities. Is the cup of the Last Supper still waiting to be found? Do insinuations of a holy bloodline truly glimmer within the tales? What is the truth behind the Grail romances? The medieval writers left us a beguiling and contradictory body of work. Some mention Joseph of Arimathea, others don't. Some name the Templars, others won't. But one theme in common threads through them all. The Holy Grail is the search itself. The earliest Grail romance was written around 1190 AD by a French poet named Chrétien de Troyes. Chrétien's hero is Percival, a young knight who aspires to win a seat at King Arthur's Round Table. The innocent Percival happens upon the Grail at a secluded castle. Once inside, Percival witnesses a solemn procession in which the Grail is repeatedly paraded through a great hall. The lord of the castle and guardian of the Grail is a king. He is plagued by a wound that will not heal, and his kingdom has become a wasteland.
The theme of woundedness in connection with the Grail story is something I think that's still very relevant to the present. Very few people would say that they are not in some way wounded, however that may manifest itself, whether physically or psychically or spiritually. And I think that when you read these stories, when you begin to see that the story is a universal one, it's telling us something very important about our own woundedness and about the possibility of healing and restoration.
In this mystical setting, Percival is unaware that he has a crucial role to play in healing the king. He must ask a question about the Grail.
Why is it so important to ask this question? Well, I think if you go back to the theme of the idea of healing, very often the first step towards healing is to ask what's wrong, is to ask why am I wounded? And in that way, you're actually beginning a process of discovering what the wound is.
Untrained in matters of the soul, Percival fails to ask the question. There are two consequences.
One, it means that the king is not healed and the land is not healed. And the second thing is that Percival himself is then thrown out of the Grail Castle and has to undergo a very long drawn-out quest and many trials and tests and tribulations before he eventually comes back to the same place and this time asks the question.
Whom does the Grail serve?
But Chrétien's Grail romance is far more than religious quest. Indeed, much of it is rollicking high adventure. Percival fights heroic battles, defends damsels, and triumphs in impossible situations. In large measure, it is a medieval Bruce Willis movie. Grail women are as bold as the men. They speak their mind and unblushingly pledge their love to handsome champions. On several occasions, Percival is sweetly rewarded for his valor.
Then the damsel makes great joy of him and leads him to her chambers to rest and take his ease. She makes him no refusal of hugging and kissing. They play and kiss and talk debonairly. Chrétien de Troyes, 1190 AD.
This frisky combination of spiritual quest and earthly adventure can be found in many Grail romances. In some of the later works, King Arthur and his court move to center stage, but the Grail is still a catalyst for action. At Camelot, the Grail magically appears and hovers above the Round Table. Arthur's knights are mesmerized. When the Grail vanishes as mysteriously as it arrived, virtually everyone at Camelot sets off to find it. Again, the twin themes of spiritual inquiry and robust adventure begin to unfold.
I think the one thing that has always excited me about the Grail stories is this idea of the search for a truth that is a little out of reach but not unattainable. I mean, what more could you ask from any set of stories than the possibility of finding a great treasure, a great spiritual insight, a wonder that might be, you know, the most important thing that you could find in your life?
The cup of the Last Supper may indeed still be hidden, awaiting discovery by a modern Grail knight. Or perhaps a descendant of the Holy Bloodline is preparing to step forward and take on the troubles of the world. But meanwhile, the Holy Grail awaits anyone who dares to seek it. There are no roadmaps on this quest. The path lies within. Nothing is certain but this: no one will find it unless they begin.